Some of the most important stories never made the news. They happened in places no camera ever reached, among people who never asked to be remembered. This is one of those stories. A farm in rural Oklahoma that fed 10 families for 70 years, and almost no one outside those families ever heard its name. The silence around it wasn't an accident, it was a choice. In the summer of 1956, when the sky turned to iron and the ground cracked open like old leather, 10 farming families in Red Valley faced the same impossible decision. Stay and watch everything die, or leave and lose the only life they knew. The drought had already taken their neighbors. One by one, farms that had stood for generations went under the auctioneer's hammer. By July, the valley looked like a graveyard of abandoned dreams. But these 10 families made a different choice. They didn't run. They didn't fight each other for what little water remained. Instead, they did something that went against every instinct a farmer has. They erased the property lines between their farms and became one. No fanfare, no newspaper coverage, no government program told them to do it. They just did it. James Turner was 28 years old when he stood in the middle of what used to be his father's wheat field and watched the other families arrive. His hands were calloused from trying to save crops that couldn't be saved. His wife, Margaret, was 7 months pregnant with their first child. Everything he owned was tied to land that was dying. "We're not going to make it alone," his neighbor said. The man's name was Samuel, and he'd already lost half his herd. But together, maybe we got a chance. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't inspiring. It was just math. 10 families pooling resources, sharing equipment, dividing labor. Red Valley Cooperative was born that afternoon, not in a meeting hall or a lawyer's office, but in a dying wheat field under a merciless sun. They drew up papers on Margaret Turner's kitchen table. Each family contributed what they had. Land, equipment, livestock, labor, everything went into a common pool. Profits would be divided equally, regardless of what you brought in. If the cooperative succeeded, everyone ate. If it failed, everyone went down together. The banks thought they were insane. One loan officer actually laughed when they presented their plan. Cooperative farming had failed in a dozen other places. Why would Red Valley be different? They didn't have a good answer to that. They just had 10 families who refused to give up. The first year almost killed them. The drought continued into 1957. Wells ran dry. Cattle died. The families rationed water so strictly that baths became a weekly luxury. Children went to school in clothes that hadn't been washed in days. Margaret Turner gave birth to Samuel Turner in August, during the worst heat wave anyone could remember. The cooperative's midwife delivered the baby by lamplight because they were saving generator fuel for the irrigation pumps. But something happened that first year that nobody expected. When you share everything, you can't hide your failures. If your section of the cooperative was struggling, everyone knew, and everyone helped. When the Johnsons lost their entire corn crop to heat, the other families didn't point fingers, they adjusted. They shifted resources, they covered the gap. The cooperative wasn't just pooling money, it was pooling survival. By 1958, the drought finally broke. Rain came back to Red Valley in sheets that turned the dust into mud and the mud into promise. The families planted again. This time, they planted smart. They rotated crops across all the land, not just their old individual plots. They shared equipment so efficiently that one tractor did the work of 3. They marketed their harvest collectively, getting better prices than any of them could have gotten alone. That year, every family paid off their debts. Every single one. The local newspaper ran a small story about it, 3 paragraphs on page 7. Local farms form cooperative. The article got the date wrong and misspelled 2 of the family names. Nobody from the cooperative called to correct it. They were too busy planting the next season's crops. Through the 1960s, while the rest of America watched the space race and the civil rights movement on television, Red Valley Cooperative just kept farming. They expanded slowly, carefully. They bought out 2 neighboring farms that were going under and folded them into the cooperative. 12 families now, then 14. James Turner became the de facto leader, though they never gave him a title. He just had a way of seeing problems before they became disasters. When grain prices started to drop in the late 60s, he convinced the cooperative to diversify. They added cattle, then chickens, then a small dairy operation. Margaret kept the books, every penny accounted for, every family getting their equal share, no matter how much or how little they'd contributed that month. Some months the Turners carried families who were struggling. Other months they were the ones being carried. It balanced out over time. Young Samuel Turner grew up thinking the cooperative was just how farming worked. He was 12 before he realized that other farms had fences between them, that other farmers competed instead of cooperating. The idea seemed bizarre to him. Why would you fight your neighbors when you could work with them? But Red Valley Cooperative remained invisible to the outside world. Agricultural journals wrote about factory farms and corporate consolidation. Government programs focused on helping individual farmers increase yields. Nobody studied the quiet cooperative in Oklahoma that was somehow making it work year after year. The families didn't care. They weren't farming for recognition. They were farming to survive. The 1970s brought new challenges. Corporate agriculture was swallowing up small farms across the Midwest. Companies with unlimited capital could undercut any price. The era of the family farm seemed to be ending, and experts said it was inevitable. Red Valley Cooperative adapted. They went niche. Instead of competing on volume, they competed on quality. They started growing specialty crops that the big operations couldn't be bothered with. Heritage wheat varieties, heirloom vegetables, grass-fed beef before anyone was calling it that. James Turner was in his 50s now, his hair going grey, his hands permanently stained from decades of work. He'd raised his son Samuel to understand the cooperative the way he understood it, not as a business arrangement, but as a survival pact. You take care of the collective takes care of you. But then came 1980, and everything changed. The farm crisis of the 1980s destroyed rural America. Interest rates went through the roof. Land values collapsed. Farmers who'd borrowed money to expand suddenly found themselves underwater. Suicide rates in farming communities spiked. Every week brought news of another auction, another family losing everything. Red Valley Cooperative felt it too. Their debt wasn't as bad as some farms, but it was bad enough. The banks came calling. Payment schedules that had seemed manageable suddenly became crushing. 3 of the newer families wanted to leave, to cut their losses while they still could. The cooperative called an emergency meeting in the Turner barn. All 14 families. This was March 1982, and the temperature outside was barely above freezing. But inside that barn, the air was hot with fear and anger. "We're going under," one farmer said. "Better to leave now than wait for the auction." James Turner stood at the front of the barn, looking at faces he'd known for 26 years. Some of these people he'd delivered crops with, celebrated births with, buried parents with. "Anybody wants to leave, you can leave," he said. "We'll settle up fair, but I'm staying. And anybody who stays, we're gonna figure this out together, same as we always have." Margaret stood beside him. Their son Samuel, now 26 years old and farming his own section of the cooperative, stood with them. 7 families stayed, 7 left. It was the worst split in the cooperative's history. Families that had worked side by side for decades said goodbye in that cold barn and never spoke again. The cooperative's land shrank by almost half overnight. But the 7 families who remained did something remarkable. They restructured everything. They renegotiated with the banks, offering what they could actually pay instead of what the banks demanded. They cut costs to the bone. They worked longer hours. They deferred their own payments so the cooperative could make its debt payments. For 3 years, nobody in Red Valley Cooperative took a salary. They grew food for themselves and sold everything else to pay the banks. They fixed equipment with spare parts and prayers. They wore clothes until they fell apart. and they survived. By 1985, the worst of the crisis was over. Red Valley Cooperative was smaller, leaner, but still alive. Most of the farms around them were gone. The valley that had once been full of family operations was now dominated by corporate agriculture. Red Valley was an island of cooperation in a sea of consolidation. And still, nobody wrote about them. No government official came to study their model. They were too small to matter, too strange to categorize. The families didn't mind. They'd learned something important during the crisis. The outside world didn't care if they succeeded or failed. The only people who mattered were the ones in the cooperative. As long as they took care of each other, they'd be okay. The 1990s brought a different kind of challenge. Samuel Turner, now leading the cooperative alongside his aging father, saw the market changing. Consumers were starting to care about how their food was grown. Words like organic and sustainable were moving from the fringe to the mainstream. The cooperative had always farmed carefully, rotating crops, minimizing chemicals because it was cheaper and because the land was all they had. But they'd never formalized it, never certified it. Samuel proposed a radical shift. Go fully organic. Get certified. Market themselves as a sustainable cooperative farm. The older generation resisted. We've always done it our way, they argued. Why change now? Because the market is changing, Samuel said, and we either change with it or we get left behind. It took 2 years of meetings, arguments, and compromise. But in 1993, Red Valley Cooperative began the 3-year process of organic certification. They cut their yields in the short term. They invested in new techniques. They learned to farm without the chemical shortcuts that conventional agriculture relied on. James Turner died in 1995 before the certification was complete. He was 67 years old. He'd spent nearly 40 years keeping the cooperative alive, and he never once gave an interview about it. At his funeral, 70 people showed up. Most of them were family, current and former cooperative members, and locals who'd known him all his life. No newspaper ran an obituary. He wasn't famous. He'd just fed 10 families for 4 decades. Samuel Turner took over fully after his father's death. Margaret was still keeping the books at age 65, her handwriting a little shakier, but her accounting as precise as ever. The organic certification came through in 1996. Red Valley Cooperative began marketing their products as sustainably grown, cooperatively owned. They found niche markets in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, restaurants that wanted to source local, consumers who cared about how their food was produced. The money wasn't huge, but it was steady. More importantly, it was predictable. The wild swings of commodity markets affected them less. They were small enough to be flexible, large enough to be efficient. A new generation was growing up in the cooperative now, Samuel's own children, the grandchildren of the original founders. Some of them went to college and never came back, but enough of them returned. Enough of them saw value in what their grandparents had built. The 2000s brought the internet, and with it, new possibilities. Red Valley Cooperative built a website, not a fancy one, just a simple page explaining who they were and what they grew. They started taking online orders. City people who wanted real food from real farmers found them. A food blogger visited in 2008 and wrote about them. The blog post got shared a few times on social media. For a week, orders spiked. Then things returned to normal. But that blog post attracted attention of a different kind. A documentarian reached out, wanting to film the cooperative, tell their story to a wider audience. The cooperative said no, politely but firmly. They weren't interested in being a story. They were interested in farming. The documentarian was baffled. Here was this amazing example of successful cooperative agriculture, surviving for over 50 years against all odds, and they didn't want anyone to know about it. "We know about it," Samuel Turner told him. "That's enough." The 2008 financial crisis hit the country hard, but Red Valley Cooperative barely noticed. They didn't have complex financial instruments. They didn't have debt they couldn't service. They had land, equipment, and each other. When the economy collapsed, they just kept farming. That's when people started to notice them, just a little. Articles about food security and local agriculture mentioned them in passing. Academic papers on alternative agricultural models cited them as a footnote. They were becoming an example, whether they wanted to be or not. But the cooperative kept its distance from the spotlight. They answered questions when asked, but they didn't seek attention. They'd seen what happened when farms became tourist attractions, when authenticity became a brand. They wanted no part of it. By 2010, the cooperative had been operating for 54 years. The original families were mostly gone now, passed away or retired, but their children and grandchildren had taken their places. The institutional knowledge had been passed down, not in manuals or training programs, but in the fields themselves, the way good farmers had always learned, by doing. Margaret Turner died in 2012 at age 82. She'd kept the cooperative's books for 56 years. Her ledgers, meticulous and detailed, told the story of the cooperative in numbers. The lean years and the good years, the investments and the payoffs, the families that joined and the families that left. At her funeral, over 100 people showed up. She delivered half of them, either as a midwife or as the grandmother figure of the cooperative. The local newspaper ran an obituary this time, 5 paragraphs. It mentioned she was a bookkeeper and a farmer. It didn't mention that she'd helped keep 10 families alive through drought, depression, and disaster. Samuel Turner was 66 years old now, the same age his father had been when he died. He'd spent his entire life in the cooperative. He'd been born into it, raised by it, and now he was helping to lead it into an uncertain future, because the future was uncertain. Corporate agriculture was bigger than ever. Climate change was making weather patterns unpredictable. Young people were leaving rural areas in droves. The cooperative was stable, but it wasn't growing. In 2015, a university researcher came to study Red Valley Cooperative. This time, they agreed to participate, not for publicity, but because the researcher was genuinely interested in how they'd survived when so many other cooperatives had failed. The study took 6 months. The researcher interviewed every member family, examined the books, analyzed their decision-making processes. What she found surprised her. Red Valley Cooperative hadn't survived because of brilliant management or lucky breaks. They'd survived because of trust. Every major decision they'd made, from pooling their land in 1956 to going organic in the 1990s, had required the families to trust each other completely. And somehow, for almost 60 years, that trust had held. The researcher's paper was published in 2016 in an obscure agricultural journal. It got cited a few times by other academics. The cooperative members didn't read it. They were too busy planting spring crops. But word was getting out, slowly, quietly. Other cooperative farms started reaching out asking for advice. How did you make it work? What's the secret? Samuel Turner's answer was always the same. There's no secret. You just take care of each other, and you don't quit. It sounded simple, but it wasn't. Taking care of each other meant sometimes putting the collective ahead of your own family. It meant working longer hours so your neighbor could take time to care for a sick child. It meant accepting less profit in a good year so everyone could survive a bad year. It meant choosing we over I every single day for decades. By 2020, Red Valley Cooperative was one of the oldest continuously operating agricultural cooperatives in Oklahoma. They'd survived drought, depression, crisis, and consolidation. They were farming the same land the original families had pooled in 1956, plus a few parcels they'd added over the years. They employed 7 families now, smaller than their peak, but stable. They were still growing organic crops, still selling directly to consumers and restaurants. They weren't rich, but nobody was going hungry. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted supply chains around the world. Grocery stores ran short of food. Corporate agriculture struggled to adapt, but Red Valley Cooperative barely noticed. They'd always sold locally. They'd always operated independently. When the world locked down, They just kept farming. In fact, 2020 was one of their best years. City people, stuck at home, ordered food online. Local sourcing became trendy. Red Valley's website got more traffic than it had in its entire existence. For a few months, it looked like the cooperative might actually expand, hire more families, buy more land. But they didn't. They maintained. They'd learned over 64 years that sustainability mattered more than growth. Better to stay small and stable than to overextend and risk collapse. Samuel Turner retired in 2023 at age 77. His daughter Rebecca took over as the primary coordinator. She was the third generation of Turners to lead the cooperative, though they still didn't use the word lead. You didn't lead a cooperative, you coordinated it. By 2025, Red Valley Cooperative had been operating for 69 years, almost 7 decades of continuous operation. Hundreds of families had been fed, thousands of acres had been farmed, millions of pounds of food had been grown and sold, and still, most people had never heard of them. They weren't in the history books, they weren't taught in business schools as a case study, they weren't featured in documentaries about American agriculture. They were just there, in rural Oklahoma, doing what they'd always done, farming collectively, sharing equally, taking care of each other. The farm that fed 10 families for 70 years, the farm no one talked about. Some stories don't need to be famous to matter. Some work is more important than recognition. Red Valley Cooperative proved that survival doesn't require headlines. It just requires people willing to put the collective before themselves, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. The land is still there. The families are still farming it. The cooperative is still operating. And most of the world still doesn't know it exists. Maybe that's exactly how it should be.